She was 6 years old, alone in a warehouse in Seoul for 3 days with no food, no water, and nothing but a crayon drawing pressed against her chest. And when the most feared crime boss in the city finally found her, blood on his hands, gun in his grip, eyes that had buried his daughter just hours before, she did not scream. She looked up at this terrifying man in the dark and whispered 7 words that stopped him cold. Can I call you Dada? Stay with me. Because what this little Ethiopian girl did not know, what makes this story almost impossible to believe, is that she had been best friends with his daughter. The daughter he had just put in the ground that same night. And the drawing she was clutching? His dead daughter drew it, the week before she died. But before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. The rain fell on Seoul like it had somewhere to be. It hammered the stone. It swallowed the streetlights whole. It drowned out everything. The distant traffic, the idle chatter of late-night vendors shutting down their stalls, the sound of a father's heart cracking open for the very last time. Kwon Ji-hoon stood at the graveside with a small blood-stained teddy bear in his hands. He had not cried. Men like him did not cry. Men like him had not cried in so long they had forgotten what it felt like, forgotten they had tear ducts at all, forgotten there was anything left in them soft enough to break. And then his daughter's casket disappeared beneath the earth, and he remembered. He remembered every bedtime story he had told with the lights off because she was scared of the dark. Every Sunday morning she had crawled into his bed at 5 a.m. and pressed her cold little feet against his legs, and he had pretended to be annoyed. Every single time she had called him Dada, in that particular way, drawing out the second syllable like it was the only word in the world that mattered. Yoon-ji. 7 years old, buried in white silk, gone because the wrong men decided the only way to wound Kwon Ji-hoon was to take the one thing he actually loved. He set the teddy bear on top of the fresh soil. Then he straightened his jacket, buttoned it closed, and turned away from the grave with the flattest, most terrifying expression his lieutenants had ever seen on his face. Not grief, not rage, nothing. That was the part that made his men flinch. Lee Sang-min, his second, his most loyal, stepped toward him with an umbrella. Ji-hoon walked past him without a word, into the waiting car, into the dark, into whatever came next. Sang-min watched the car pull away and whispered to no one in particular, God help whoever ordered that hit. 3. The Gangnam warehouse sat at the end of a dead street. Every light inside it wrong, too bright, too frantic. The kind of brightness that meant someone was moving things they should not be moving and doing it fast. Rival territory. Jeon Byung-soo's men. The same organization that had pulled the trigger 6 hours ago and thought they were untouchable. Ji-hoon's team moved through the side entrance like smoke. There was no announcement, there was no negotiation, there was only the clean, methodical sound of a man who had decided the world owed him a debt he intended to collect in full. His men swept room by room. Warehouse floor cleared, storage corridor cleared, secondary exit blocked. Sang-min spoke quietly into his earpiece. East wing is clean. Moving to the back storage. Ji-hoon moved ahead without answering. The back storage room smelled of rust, damp concrete, and something else, something small, afraid, and alive. He pushed the door open. Stacked crates, broken pallets, a rusted shelf tipped sideways against the far wall. And behind it, tucked into the narrowest possible gap between the shelf and the corner, a shape that was too small to be a threat and too still to be anything good. Ji-hoon raised his gun. The shape flinched. He lowered the weapon by 2 inches, in the gap between the shelf and the wall. Wedged into the dark like she was trying to become part of it, was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, maybe younger, it was hard to tell because she was so thin, her clothes so dirty, her face streaked with grime and old tears, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been hiding and afraid for a very long time. Her hair was matted, her shoes were 2 different sizes. In her hands, pressed against her chest with both arms wrapped tight around it, she was holding a folded piece of paper. She looked up at him. He was enormous. He was blood-spattered. He was wearing the face of a man who had just lowered a 6-year-old girl's father into the ground and walked away from the grave without blinking. She should have screamed. Every child screamed. Instead, she looked at him for a long, trembling moment, and then, in a voice so small, it barely existed at all, she whispered, Can I call you Dada? She swallowed. Her bottom lip shook. I don't have one anymore, she said. The warehouse was completely silent. Sang-min, standing 3 feet behind Ji-hoon, stopped breathing. Ji-hoon did not move. The rain hammered the roof. Somewhere outside, one of his men shouted a distance clear. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, twice, held. The little girl's eyes never left his face. And Kwon Ji-hoon, the man who had walked away from his daughter's grave without a single tear, the man whose own lieutenants were afraid to make eye contact, the most feared name in 3 districts of Seoul, felt something shift in his chest so violently it nearly buckled his knees. He did not speak. He did not holster his weapon. He just stared at her. And for the first time in 3 hours his face was not nothing. Ji-hoon crouched down. It was not a gentle movement. Nothing about this man was gentle. Not the way he held himself. Not the economy of his stillness. Not the quiet that surrounded him like a warning. But he crouched down to her level, and that alone seemed to startle her more than the gun had. She pressed herself further into the corner. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and for the first time, he registered what he was actually seeing. Not just a child. A little girl with deep brown skin and thick matted coils of hair pulled into 2 uneven puffs, one half fallen loose. Ethiopian, he guessed, from the shape of her face, the particular delicacy of her features. What she was doing in a Gangnam warehouse in the middle of a Seoul rainstorm was a question that would come later. Right now there was only the fact of her tiny, filthy, shivering, alive. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She blinked slowly, like even that cost her energy. "Mira. How long have you been in here, Mira?" She looked at her fingers, counted 3. "Since the loud night," she said. Her Korean was halting but real, a child who had been living in this city long enough to learn it from the ground up, the way children do, through necessity and play and survival. 3 days. She had been hiding in this warehouse for 3 days. Ji-hoon stood up and turned to Sang-min with one hand extended. Sang-min blinked. "What?" "Your jacket, boss. This is..." Ji-hoon looked at him. Sang-min removed his jacket without finishing the sentence. Ji-hoon draped it over the girl's shoulders without ceremony. She vanished inside it, only her face showing, and her hands, still pressing that folded piece of paper hard against her chest, like it was the last thing tethering her to something real. He looked at the paper. "What is that?" She pulled it tighter. "Mine." Something moved in his expression, not impatience, something older and quieter than impatience. He knew what it was to hold an object like that, with both hands, with your whole body, because the moment you loosened your grip, the last physical proof of something would cease to exist. "I won't take it," he said. "I'm asking what it is." A long pause. The rain was loud on the roof. Somewhere outside a door banged in the wind. Then slowly, with the gravity of a decision she had been sitting with for 3 days in the dark, Mira unfolded the paper and held it up. Ji-hoon looked at it. Everything stopped. A child's drawing crayon on notebook paper. The colors smeared slightly at the folds. The proportions gloriously, heartbreakingly wrong the way only a 7-year-old's are. 2 little girls holding hands, one with straight black hair and pale skin, one with big round puffs and deep brown skin and the widest smile on the page, both of them in matching yellow dresses. And above them, in the careful, proud block letters of someone who had recently conquered handwriting, "Me and my new little sister." Bottom corner, smaller, Inji, age 7, the paper had begun to shake. Ji-hoon looked down and realized it was his hand causing it. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Not a question. His voice had dropped to something barely above a frequency. Mira looked up at him. "She drew it for me, the week before the loud night." She touched the edge of the paper carefully, like it was a living thing. "She said she was going to ask her appa to let me come live with them. She said she was going to make him say yes because she always made him say yes." Ji-hoon's jaw locked. "She talked about her appa a lot," Mira continued, with the devastating honesty of a 6-year-old who had no idea what she was doing to the man in front of her. "She said he was very scary, but his eyes were kind. She said he was the safest person in the world even though nobody else thought so." A small pause. "She called him appa mostly, but when she was scared, she called him Dada. She said that was her secret word, the one that meant I really need you." Behind Ji-hoon, Sang-min pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. "She was my best friend," Mira said. Her voice thinned at the edges. "My abeoji, my father, he worked in this city. He brought me here with him. But then some men..." She stopped, swallowed, started again in a smaller voice. "Some men came to where we were staying, and after that it was only me." The temperature in the room changed. Ji-hoon's eyes moved to Sang-min. A look passed between them fast, sharp, full of meaning that Mira could not read. Sang-min gave a single small nod. "I'll find out who." "Onji found me," Mira continued. "At the yellow door place. The weekend place with the aunties. She walked in the first Sunday and she sat right next to me even though I didn't speak much Korean yet, and she said, a ghost of something crossed her face, the memory so vivid it almost looked like joy for a second. She said, you have sad eyes but a nice mouth, I think we should be friends. Mira almost smiled. She was like that, she just decided things. Ji-hoon could hear it. He could hear exactly how Eunji would have said it chin up, completely certain, because she had never once encountered a problem she didn't believe she could fix with enough stubbornness and enough love. Child reciting something they have repeated to themselves many times in the dark. We snuck outside. We were not supposed to. It was getting dark, but Eunji wanted to count the red cars on the big road because she had a game. She stopped, breathed. Then the loud sounds started. And Eunji grabbed me. She was bigger than me, so she pushed me behind a car and she stood in front and she shouted, run to the big building. Mira, run and don't look back. The fluorescent light above them flickered, held. I ran, Mira said. I didn't look back, because she told me not to. But when I came back. She couldn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. She looked at me, Mira whispered. And she said, tell my appa I love him. Tell him I was not scared. Tell him his eyes are kind. The silence that followed had weight to it. Ji-hoon had spent 3 hours constructing a war out of the space where his grief should have been. He had planned routes. He had assigned targets. He had walked away from the grave with a flat face and cold hands and the absolute certainty that action was the only language available to him now. Tell him I was not scared. She had known. Somehow, at 7 years old, in the worst moment, she had known exactly what her father would torture himself with. And she had sent a message back through the only messenger available to her, this small Ethiopian girl in mismatched shoes, who had survived because Eunji had placed herself between danger and the people she loved, just like her father had always done. Ji-hoon turned away. Sang-min looked at the floor. The two men in the doorway looked at the ceiling. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They gave him the only thing they could give him, which was the dignity of not watching. Behind him he heard small shuffling footsteps. Then something pressed against the back of his arm, light, warm, steady. He looked down. Mira had crossed the warehouse floor in Sang-min's oversized jacket and pressed her cheek against him, not hugging, not grabbing, just leaning, the way she must have seen someone do it once, a long time ago, when the world was smaller and safer and her father was still in it. She didn't say anything. She just stayed there. Ji-hoon stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he looked down at the top of her head, those two uneven puffs of hair, one fully loose now and something in his chest that had been clenched since the hospital called finally moved. One night, he said, his voice was barely functional. You stay one night, and then we find somewhere proper. Mira considered this. Then she tipped her head up and looked at him with absolute seriousness. Okay, she said. But I need Exayabur. Sorry, I need food first. I have not eaten since yesterday morning. From the doorway, one of the younger guards made a strangled sound and immediately pretended to cough. Sang-min turned fully to face the wall. Ji-hoon looked down at this small, starving, undefeated child who had survived 3 days alone in a cold warehouse and still had the presence of mind to negotiate. Get the car, he said quietly, and for the first time since the grave, his voice did not sound like the opening move of a war. The penthouse was the kind of silence that cost money. 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, soul spread out below like a circuit board someone had set on fire, all neon and rain, and the distant blur of the Han River. Imported stone floors. Furniture that had never been sat in casually. A kitchen that had been used exactly twice, both times by staff. Mira walked in and stopped in the middle of the living room. She turned in a slow circle, neck craned back, taking in the height of the ceilings, the size of the windows, the enormous empty gray space of it. Then she looked at Ji-hoon. You live here alone? Yes, Ji-hoon responded. She looked around again. Something in her small face shifted, not awe, not envy, something closer to concern. That's very sad, she said. Sang-min, standing by the elevator, pressed his lips together very hard. Ji-hoon looked at her for a moment. Then he walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There was a bottle of imported water, 2 containers of leftover food from a restaurant that delivered twice a week, and a single pair that had been there long enough to have opinions about it. He stared at the contents. Mira appeared at his elbow, barely reaching his hip. and peered in alongside him with great seriousness. "I can cook," she announced. "You're 6, he said. "I am almost 7, and my Abiyaji taught me." She was already pulling open the lower cabinets with the confidence of someone who had decided this was her kitchen now. "Do you have rice? Injera?" "No, you won't have injera. Do you have eggs?" "Mira," Ji-hoon called. "Ramyeon." She had found a stack of instant noodle packets in the back of a cabinet, behind a bottle of whiskey that had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She emerged holding 2 packets above her head like trophies. "I know how to make this. Eun-ji showed me." Ji-hoon looked at the ramyeon packets, then at her. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make it." "You don't know how. I know how to make ramyeon." She squinted at him with an expression that communicated, politely but clearly, that she had serious doubts about this. Then she climbed onto one of the kitchen stools, a process that required significantly more effort than she would admit, and sat with her hands folded on the counter, supervising. Ji-hoon made the ramyeon. It was not complicated. It should not have been an event, but Mira narrated every step in a running commentary that was half Korean, half Amharic, delivered with the solemn authority of a head chef. "More water. The fire is too high. Yoonji always put an egg in. Do you have an egg? You should always have eggs." And somewhere in the middle of it, Ji-hoon realized that 12 minutes had passed, and he had not thought about the grave once. He put the egg in. Mira nodded, satisfied. They ate at the kitchen counter because the dining table was the size of a small country and felt absurd for 2 people, one of whom was barely visible above the countertop. Mira ate with focused, unself-conscious hunger, both hands on the chopsticks, cheeks working, occasionally making small sounds of approval that she didn't seem to notice she was making. Ji-hoon watched her. He was not eating. He had the bowl in front of him and the chopsticks in his hand, and he was watching this child eat like it was the most important thing he had witnessed in years. Which, he was beginning to understand, it might have been. She caught him looking. "Eat," she said, pointing at his bowl with her chopsticks. "Food is not good when it's cold." He ate. He put her in Eun-ji's room. It was the only room in the penthouse that had any warmth in it, pale yellow walls, a low bed with a canopy, shelves of books and small plush animals, and the particular organized chaos of a child who had strong feelings about where things belonged. He had not been able to touch it. In the 3 weeks since the hospital, he had walked past the door every day and not opened it once. He opened it now. Mira stood in the doorway and looked in. "This was hers," she said quietly, not a question. "Yes." She stepped inside carefully, like the room deserved respect. She touched the edge of the bookshelf lightly, looked at the plush animals, looked at the small frame drawing on the wall, one of Eun-ji's, a lopsided yellow house with a very large sun. Then she turned to Ji-hoon with something careful in her eyes. "Is it okay for me to sleep here?" He had to look away for a second. "She would want you to," he said. His voice came out steadier than he deserved. Mira nodded, accepting this with the same quiet gravity she seemed to bring to everything. Then she climbed into the bed still in Sang-min's jacket, which he was never getting back, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Ji-hoon turned off the main light, left the small star-shaped lamp on, the one Yoon-ji had picked herself from a market in Insadong because it threw little light points on the ceiling that she said looked like the stars were visiting. He was at the door when Mira spoke. "She told me you check the room at night," she said from under the blanket. "When she was sleeping." She said she always pretended not to know, but she always knew. Ji-hoon's hand tightened on the doorframe. She said it was her favorite part of the day. Mira continued drowsily, already sliding towards sleep. Because it meant even when he was scary to everyone else, he was just her Dada at night. He stood in the doorway for a long time after she fell asleep. He stood there quietly, waiting as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened. After a moment, she made a small sound and turned over, her hair gently spreading across the pillow like a dark halo. He turned off the star lamp last. By morning, the penthouse had changed. He could not have explained how. Precisely, the furniture was in the same place. The stone floors were still cold. The city was still gray and wet below the windows. But there were small shoes by the front door that were not his. There was a handprint on the kitchen counter from where she had leaned to look at something. There was a folded drawing on the coffee table. She had found crayons in Eun-ji's room, and apparently felt the living room walls had been blank long enough. He picked up the drawing, 2 figures. One very tall, one very small. The tall one had what was either a very severe expression or a mustache. He chose to believe it was a severe expression. The small one had 2 enormous puffs of hair and was holding the tall one's hand, Below them, in large uneven letters, working through a language that was not her first. Dada and Mira. Ji-hoon sat down on his very expensive, never casually sat-in sofa. He sat there for a while. Sang-min arrived at 9 with 3 lieutenants and a briefing folder and found his boss sitting on the sofa staring at a crayon drawing. He set the folder on the table. Ji-hoon did not look up. The Jeon hit, Sang-min said carefully. We have a window this weekend. Clean entry, confirmed location, minimal. Push it. Sang-min paused. Boss, push it 2 weeks. The 3 lieutenants exchanged a look that they immediately regretted, because Ji-hoon looked up at exactly the wrong moment, and each of them found something urgent to study in a different direction. She needs a doctor first, Ji-hoon said, as if this explained everything, which to him apparently it did. And clothes, and her hair. He paused. Someone needs to do something about her hair. Find someone who knows how. His hands. Ji-hoona, he said, which was the name he only used when the boss title felt inadequate. The one-night plan. I heard myself say it. And, Ji-hoon looked down at the drawing again, at the 2 figures, at the enormous puffs of hair, at the 4 letters under the tall, severe figure's feet. Ethiopian man. He worked in this city, find out who, find out where, find out everything. Sang-min went very still. You think it connects? I think a 6-year-old girl ends up alone in a rival gang's warehouse. 3 days after her father is killed, and the only person looking for her is nobody. He set the drawing down with more care than he had touched anything in weeks. Find out. Sang-min nodded once and turned to go. And Sang-min, he stopped. Armani makes children's clothes, Ji-hoon said. I assume. Sang-min turned around fully, stared at his boss, looked at the lieutenants, looked back. I'll check, he said, from down the hallway. Small feet padded toward the kitchen, and a child's voice called out in the particular demanding tone of someone who had woken up hungry and seen absolutely no reason to be subtle about it. Dada, there are no eggs. I told you about the eggs. One of the lieutenants, the youngest one, barely 22, made a sound like air escaping a tire and had to leave the room. Ji-hoon stood up, and for the second time in 12 hours, Kwon Ji-hoon feared, ruthless, the most dangerous name in 3 districts of Seoul, walked to his kitchen to be corrected about grocery shopping by a 6-year-old Ethiopian girl in an Armani jacket. The war could wait. 3 days passed. Just 3 days and the penthouse was unrecognizable, not structurally. The stone floors were still cold, the windows still enormous, the furniture still the kind that cost more than most people's cars. But there were crayon drawings on the refrigerator now, held up with magnets that Mira had found in a kitchen drawer and deployed without asking. There was a small pair of braided hair ties on the bathroom counter next to his expensive imported cologne. There was a Pororo episode paused on the living room television, the largest screen in the building, originally purchased for security feed monitoring because Mira had discovered it and declared it the perfect size for cartoons, and Ji-hoon had not found a single convincing argument against this. He had also, at some point in the last 72 hours, learned the names of every character in Pororo. He would take this secret to his grave. The doctor came on the second morning, a quiet, discreet woman that Sang-min trusted and confirmed what Ji-hoon had already read in the hollows of Mira's cheeks, and the way she ate like every meal might be her last. Mild malnutrition, a chest that needed watching, nothing that consistent food, warmth, and rest would not fix. Mira sat through the examination with enormous dignity, answering every question seriously, and then immediately negotiated a second bowl of the porridge Ji-hoon's housekeeper had made, by informing everyone present that medicine worked better on a full stomach. Nobody had the medical knowledge to disprove this. She got the second bowl. The hair situation was resolved on the 3rd day. Sang-min, who had made 17 phone calls and consulted 2 people he would never publicly admit to consulting, arrived with a woman named Aisha, who ran a natural hair studio in Mapogu and had agreed to a house call for a fee that Sang-min described only as significant. Mira took one look at Aisha's own hair, a magnificent crown of twisted locks, and her entire face changed. You know how to do puffs? She asked immediately. Baby, I know how to do everything, Aisha said. For the next 2 hours, Ji-hoon's penthouse was occupied by the sound of a child talking without pause in Korean, in Amharic, in the hybrid of the two she was, apparently developing in real time, while Aisha worked through the tangles with oil and patience and occasional laughter. Ji-hoon sat in the adjacent room pretending to review financial documents. He had read the same paragraph 11 times. At one point Mira called out, "Dada, come look," and he was in the doorway before he had consciously decided to move. She was sitting cross-legged on the bathroom counter, two perfect puffs restored, beaming at him in the mirror with the full force of a child who had just been made to feel like herself again. He looked at her in the mirror for a moment. "Good," he said. She rolled her eyes at Aisha. "He always says just good. I think that's his word for everything." Aisha glanced in the mirror at the large tattooed crime boss standing in the doorway looking at this child like she had hung the moon. "I think it might be," she agreed. It happened on the fourth evening. Small things had been gathering all day, the particular restlessness of a child processing something too large for her, showing up in the way Mira kept going quiet in the middle of sentences, kept looking at corners of rooms, kept folding and unfolding the crayon drawing she carried everywhere now. The one that said Dada and Mira. Ji-hoon noticed. He noticed everything. It was, professionally speaking, his most dangerous skill, and it worked just as well on 6-year-old Ethiopian girls as it did on rival gang lieutenants. He waited. After dinner eggs, which they now always had, because Sang-min had added it to a standing grocery order, without being asked a second time, Mira sat at the kitchen counter and did not immediately begin her post-meal commentary, which was unusual enough that Ji-hoon set down his cup and looked at her. She was staring at the refrigerator, at the drawings she had stuck there. "Mira," she looked up. "What is it?" She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, very carefully, like someone who had decided to put down something heavy they had been carrying alone. "In the warehouse, before your men came, there were other men there first." Ji-hoon went still. "What men?" "I don't know their names. They came 2 nights before you." She pulled at the edge of her sleeve. "I was very far back behind the crates so they didn't see me. But I could hear." She paused. "They were talking about Shadow Lotus." The air in the kitchen changed. Ji-hoon's voice stayed completely even, a skill that had taken 20 years to develop and currently required everything he had. "What did they say about Shadow Lotus?" Mira looked at him. Her eyes, always serious, always older than they should have been, moved over his face like she was checking something. She studied him for another second. Then she nodded, accepting this, and took a breath. "One of them said, I'm trying to remember exactly." She pressed her lips together in concentration. "He said, the insider confirmed the girl's schedule. Same as every Sunday. The old man doesn't know yet." She looked up, and the other one said, "By the time he finds out, Shadow Lotus will already be bleeding from inside." The silence that followed was absolute. Ji-hoon's right hand, resting on the counter, was completely still. Every trained instinct he possessed was currently devoted to keeping his face neutral, his body calm, his breathing even, because the child in front of him was watching him with enormous, careful eyes, and he had promised her the quiet kind of anger. Insider. Shadow Lotus will already be bleeding from inside. Someone in his own organization had given Onji's location to Jeon Byung-soo's men. Not just a leak, not carelessness. A deliberate, specific, targeted betrayal, someone who knew his daughter's Sunday schedule, knew which route she took, knew exactly when and where she would be exposed. Someone he had trusted. Someone who was still inside Shadow Lotus right now, attending briefings, eating at his table, looking him in the eye. "There was one more thing," Mira said, quieter now. He looked at her. "One of them had a laughing voice, high, like this." She demonstrated, a reedy, slightly breathless laugh that was so specific, so precisely imitated, that it could only have come from a real memory. "And the other one said his name, when they were leaving." She paused. "He called him Ryu." The name landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Ji-hoon heard it, processed it, felt it travel through him with the particular coldness of something that explained too much too fast all the small wrong things that had not added up, the gaps in intelligence that should not have been gaps, the one person in his inner circle who had been present for every relevant briefing and whose loyalty Ji-hoon had never once questioned because the man had been beside him for 15 years. Park Ryu, 40 years old, calm-voiced, meticulous, godfather to Yoon-ji at her naming ceremony. Ji-hoon stood up from the counter very slowly. "Dada," he stopped. Mira had slid off her stool and was standing in front of him, and she did something then that she had never done before. She reached up and took his hand in both of hers, her small dark fingers wrapping around 2 of his, holding on with the focused grip of a child who understood, instinctively, that the person in front of her was standing at the edge of something. "I know what that face means," she said. "My Abeoji made that face once, before he went somewhere and didn't come back." The sentence hit him squarely in the chest. He looked down at her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. You promise? The word sat between them. Simple, devastating, the kind of word that men in his world did not use because promises in this life had a way of becoming graves. He had spent 15 years refusing to make them. He looked at this small girl Ethiopian, fatherless, survivor, carrying NG's last words and a crayon drawing, and the single piece of information that had just rewritten everything, and he thought about what it cost her to ask. I promise, he said. Mira held his hand for another moment. Then she nodded, satisfied, with the air of someone who had just secured a binding legal contract. Okay, she said. Then you can go do your scary thing. But come back. She let go of his hand and climbed back onto the stool, and picked up her spoon and finished her eggs with complete composure, as if she had not just single-handedly dismantled the most dangerous question in Seoul, and handed him the answer wrapped in the small, careful voice of a child who had learned to be brave because there was no other option. Ji-hoon watched her for 3 seconds. Then he walked to the hallway and called Sang-min. When Sang-min picked up, Ji-hoon said only 4 words, in the flat, precise tone that his second-in-command had learned over 15 years, meant the world was about to rearrange itself. Find everything on Ryu. A pause. Boss Park Ryu? Sang-min stuttered. Everything. Tonight. Ji-hoon said. He hung up, stood in the hallway for a moment, looked back through the doorway at Mira, who was now examining her empty bowl, and strongly considering whether to request a 3rd serving. She looked up, caught him watching, and pointed at the bowl with her spoon. There are no more eggs either, she said. We need to talk about the shopping again. And somewhere beneath the ice, the rage, and the 15-year betrayal burning through his chest, Kwon Ji-hoon felt something shift in his expression, something that, had anyone been close enough and brave enough to notice, might have resembled a smile. Sang-min called back at 2 a.m. Ji-hoon was awake. He had not tried to sleep. He had sat in the living room in the dark with the city burning silently. 42 floors below him and Mira's crayon drawing on the coffee table in front of him, waiting for the phone to ring the way a man waits for a verdict he already knows is guilty. He picked up before the 2nd ring. Sang-min's voice on the other end was the specific flat tone he only used when what he had found was worse than what he had been looking for. Talk, Ji-hoon said. He took a breath. Then, Ryu has been on Jeon Byung-soo's payroll for 8 months. Separate account, routed through a shell company in Busan. Small enough amounts to avoid pattern flags. Consistent enough to be a salary. There was a pause. He's been feeding them everything. Rotes, safe house rotations, meeting schedules. Another pause, heavier than the others. Yoonji's Sunday schedule. Ji-hoon said nothing. There's more, Sang-min said. Tell me. The Ethiopian man, Mira's father, his name was Tadesse, engineer, legitimate work visa, 18 months in Seoul, subcontracted to a logistics company in Mapogu. The sound of papers. The logistics company is a front. Shell ownership traces back 4 layers and lands on. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Ji-hoon to already know the answer. Jeon Byung-soo. The city below the window went on burning. Indifferent. Tadesse found something, Sang-min continued. We don't have everything. Yet. But based on the financial trail he was handling freight manifests, he would have seen the real cargo. He started asking questions he wasn't supposed to ask. 2 weeks later, he was dead. The papers again. Ruled a street robbery, nobody looked twice. He was foreign, he was alone, and nobody was looking for the truth. Ji-hoon stood up from the sofa. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at Seoul, and for a long moment he thought about a man named Tadesse, who had come to the city to build something, who had brought his daughter with him because perhaps there was no one else to leave her with, or perhaps because he simply could not bear to be that far from her, and who had died alone on a street in a city that did not know his name, for the crime of being honest in a place that punished honesty. He thought about Mira saying, "Some men came and after that it was only me." He thought about NG finding her at the Yellow Door place. 2 little girls, one Korean, one Ethiopian, one with a father who ran one of the most feared criminal organizations in Seoul, one with a father who had just stumbled into the edges of it, finding each other anyway. Matching smiles, matching yellow dresses and a crayon drawing, best friends in the way children become best friends completely, immediately, without audition. He thought about Eunji standing in front of Mira on the worst night. He thought about the word insider. Ryu had known Eunji's Sunday schedule because Ji-hoon had mentioned it in passing at a Monday briefing, proud. Briefly, the way he allowed himself to be proud in front of his most trusted men that Eunji had started volunteering at a children's charity, that she went every Sunday. that she had apparently made a best friend there. He had given Ryu the information himself. Ji-hoon pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window. The rage was there. Of course it was there. It had been there since the hospital. A dark, massive thing living in the center of him that he had been feeding with planning and strategy and forward motion. But it was different now. It had a shape now, a name. And underneath it, deeper than the rage, was something that felt almost like the specific grief of a man who understood that the person who destroyed his world had been standing beside him at the funeral. "Where is he now?" Ji-hoon said. "Ryu is in Busan. He went down yesterday, said it was a supplier meeting. I think he knows we're close." There was a pause. "Or he thinks you're still too broken to move. He's about to learn the difference." "Ji-hoon," Sang Min's voice shifted, lost the operational tone, became the voice of the man who had known him since they were both 23 and stupid and trying not to die. "What about the girl?" Ji-hoon turned from the window. Down the hallway, Yoonji's door was closed. Behind it, Mira was asleep, probably still clutching the crayon drawing, the star lamp off because she had told him gravely on the second night that she was almost 7 and did not need it, and then asked him 3 minutes later if he could leave it on just a little bit. He had left it on. "The girl stays here," he said. "Double the building security. Nobody comes or goes without my direct approval. Sang Min, nobody. Not suppliers, not staff, not anyone whose face I have not personally cleared." "Understood. And Ryu?" "Bring him back from Busan. Quietly. I want him in the Mappo safe house by tomorrow night." A pause. "Tell him I need a meeting. Tell him it's about the Jian situation. Tell him." Ji-hoon's voice stayed flat, stayed even, stayed completely professional. "Tell him I trust only him with this." The silence on the line was brief. "Understood," Sang Min said. He checked on her before he went to bed. He always did now. It had become a fact of the last 4 days, as natural and non-negotiable as breathing. He opened the door quietly, and the star lamp threw its small lights across the ceiling. She had turned it on after all. Sometime in the night, and Mira was curled on her side with both hands tucked under her cheek and the crayon drawing on the pillow beside her, like a second small person keeping her company. He stood in the doorway. She said she always pretended not to know, but she always knew. He stood there until the tightness in his chest eased slightly. Then, he pulled the door nearly shut, went to his room, and lay on top of the covers in the dark. He stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep for a long time. The mistake happened the next afternoon. It wasn't Mira's fault. He would make sure of that. He would say it to Sang Min, say it to himself, and refuse to let it become a thing that sat between them. She was 6 years old, curious, and for the past 4 days she had learned that this penthouse was safe. She had learned that the big, scary man with the kind eyes kept his promises, and that the world inside these walls was different from the one outside. She had simply started to believe it. He had stepped out to the building's private terrace to take a call. 10 minutes, door left open. Mira settled at the kitchen counter with a drawing pad, and the focused energy of someone working on something important. The housekeeper was in the next room. The building was locked down. There was no reason for anything to go wrong. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that one of the new building security staff had been placed there 4 days ago. Not by Sang Min, not by anyone Ji-hoon had cleared. By Jeon Byung-soo's people, who had been watching the penthouse since the night Ji-hoon brought an unexpected small person home from a warehouse raid, and the word had quietly, fatally slipped through the wrong set of ears. The security camera feed that the new guard had been feeding out for 4 days had not shown Mira's face clearly. She was small. She moved fast. The angles were wrong. Until that afternoon, when Mira decided that the terrace looked interesting and walked out to find Ji-hoon, and stood in the open air for exactly 40 seconds with her face tilted up at the Seoul skyline like she was trying to memorize it, while a camera she did not know existed captured every detail. Ji-hoon turned and saw her. His whole body went cold. He crossed the terrace in 4 steps, scooped her up without explanation, and carried her back inside with one arm, while his other hand was already reaching for his phone. She made a sound of protest. She had been in the middle of looking at something, and then felt the tension in his body, and went quiet immediately, with the animal instinct of a child who had learned early that when an adult went that still, you match them. "Sang Min," he said the moment the call connected. "Boss," the new security guard on the east corridor, who cleared him. A beat of silence, then rapid keyboard sounds, then a silence of a completely different quality. "Ji-hoon?" "How long?" 4 days, Sangmin's voice was stripped down to its bones. He's gone. Booth is empty. I'm looking at the feed right now. He left 12 minutes ago. Ji-hoon set Mira down on the sofa. He crouched in front of her and held her face in both hands gently, the way he had not known he knew how to do until 4 days ago, and looked at her very directly. She looked back at him without flinching. She had the bravest eyes he had ever seen in his life. Listen to me, he said. We need to move, right now. You're going to do exactly what I say, and you're not going to be scared. Mira held his gaze. I'm not scared, she said, and her voice only shook a little bit. Good girl, he stood up, back into the phone. Get the cars. And Sangmin, find Ryu. Right now. If he hears about the security breach before we get to him, he'll run, and I will burn this entire city down finding him. Already on it. A pause. Ji-hoon, they've seen her face. They know she's real. They're going to come for her. I know. They're going to use her to get to you. I know. His voice was very quiet. That's the last mistake they're going to make. He hung up. Mira was standing now, small and straight in the middle of the enormous living room, clutching the crayon drawing in both hands. She had picked it up from the coffee table without thinking, the way she always reached for it when the world shifted. She looked at him. Are we running away? She asked. We're moving somewhere safer. Together? The word was so small, so careful. The whole weight of the last 4 days was inside it, every meal, every egg conversation, every Pororo episode, every time she had fallen asleep knowing he was standing in the doorway. Ji-hoon looked at the 6-year-old Ethiopian girl who had walked into his life through the worst night of it and had proceeded, with complete, unhurried certainty, to make herself indispensable. Together, he said. Mira exhaled, nodded once. Then she tucked the drawing inside her shirt, close to her chest, and looked at him with an expression of total readiness. Okay, she said. I'm ready. But Dada, what? Can we take the eggs? Somewhere in the wreckage of everything, the betrayal, the breach, the war now fully arrived at his door. Ji-hoon felt it again. That thing in his face. That impossible, inconvenient, completely unstoppable thing. Yes, he said. We can take the eggs. He picked her up and walked to the door and did not look back at the penthouse, at the drawings, on the refrigerator, at the Pororo paused on the screen, at the 42 floors of cold, expensive silence that had somehow, in 4 days, become something that resembled a home. He had everything that mattered. He was holding her. The Mapo safe house smelled like old wood and river damp. It sat at the end of a narrow lane, 3 blocks from the Han. Unremarkable from the outside, a 2-story building with shuttered windows and a rusted gate that looked abandoned because it was supposed to look abandoned. Inside, it was reinforced steel, monitored exits, a generator that could run the building dark for 72 hours, and enough firepower in the basement to start a small war. Ji-hoon was about to start a slightly larger one. Mira had fallen asleep in the car on the way over, one cheek pressed against his arm, the crayon drawing still tucked inside her shirt. He had carried her inside without waking her, and put her in the back room on the 2nd floor, the most interior room in the building. No windows, 2 locked doors between her and the outside world, and stood over her for a moment in the dark. She looked younger when she was sleeping. 6 years old in a way she rarely allowed herself to look when she was awake, when she was busy being brave, being composed, being the girl who had survived 3 days alone in a warehouse and come out the other side still capable of negotiating for eggs. He pulled the blanket up. Then he went downstairs to the basement where Park Ryu was already waiting. Ryu was sitting at the table when Ji-hoon walked in, 53 years old, silver at his temples, a face that Ji-hoon had read as calm and trustworthy for 15 years and was only now understanding had simply been practiced. He was dressed like a man who had come to a business meeting, which was exactly the performance he had calculated Ji-hoon would expect, composed, unhurried, nothing to hide. He stood when Ji-hoon entered. Ji-hoona, I came as soon as Sangmin called. I heard there was a security breach at the penthouse. What do we know? Ji-hoon sat down across from him. He did not speak immediately. He had learned a long time ago that silence was the most destabilizing thing you could do to a guilty man. Innocent men filled silence with questions. Guilty men filled it with performance. Ryu maintained his composure for 11 seconds. Then something moved behind his eyes, small, fast, gone, and Ji-hoon saw the exact moment the man understood that this was not a briefing. The Busan account, Ji-hoon said. The shell in Mapo, 8 months, Ryu. 8 months you sat across from me at that table and looked me in the eye. Ryu's face did something complicated. Then it settled, and what it settled into was not shame, not remorse, not the collapse of a man caught. It settled into the particular cold composure of someone who had already prepared for this conversation and decided exactly how to play it. Ji-hoon. Yoonji's Sunday schedule. Ji-hoon's voice was completely flat. You were in that briefing. I told you myself. I told you she had made a friend at the charity. I told you she went every Sunday. A pause. I was proud of her. I wanted you to know. Something finally cracked in Ryu's face. Not guilt, something worse. Something that looked almost like the memory of having cared, once, before he had made too many small compromises to find his way back. Jiyeon made an offer I couldn't, he said. Don't. Ji-hoon's hand came down on the table. Not a slam, something quieter, more final. Don't tell me what he offered. Don't tell me you had reasons. Don't tell me anything that asks me to understand this, because I will tell you right now there is no version of this I will ever understand. Ryu looked at him. You were her godfather, Ji-hoon said. The basement went completely silent. Ryu looked away first. What happened next was not fast. It was not dramatic in the way people imagined these things would be. There was no explosion of violence, no raised voices, no chaos. It was methodical, surgical, the kind of reckoning that had been 15 years in the making and required no theatrics because the weight of it was already enough. By the time Ji-hoon came back upstairs, Ryu had given them everything, every contact, every transmission, every piece of information he had passed to John Byung-soo's organization over 8 months. Including the one thing Ji-hoon had not expected. Ryu had told Jiyeon about Mira 3 days ago. Not just that she existed, not just that she was in the penthouse. He had told Jiyeon exactly what she had seen in the warehouse, what she had heard, what she could identify. Jeon Byung-soo did not want Mira as leverage. He wanted her gone. Sang-min was waiting at the top of the basement stairs. One look at Ji-hoon's face told him everything he needed to know about what had happened in the basement. He had worked beside this man for 17 years, and he had seen that expression exactly twice before, and both times it had preceded something that was still discussed in certain circles of Seoul, in hushed tones. Talk, Ji-hoon said. Jiyeon has a team moving. We picked up chatter 20 minutes ago, 6 men, 2 vehicles, they have the safe house location. Sang-min's jaw was tight. Ryu must have transmitted before he came in. Ji-hoon processed this without breaking stride, moving through the safe house to the security station, where 3 of his men were monitoring feeds. How long? 20 minutes, maybe less. Get Mira out. To where? If they have this location, they may have. There's a secondary site in Yongsan, Aisha. He was already at the monitors, reading the camera feeds, with the fast, systematic sweep of someone who had spent 20 years learning to see threats before they materialized. Call Aisha. She doesn't exist in any of our records. Ryu had no way to flag her. Take Mira there. Sang-min hesitated. One beat the hesitation of a man who had something to say, and was deciding whether to say it. And you? Ji-hoon looked at him. I'm staying, he said. Ji-hoon. 6 men, 2 vehicles. He turned back to the monitors. Tell the others to pull back to the perimeter. I don't want anyone caught in the middle of this that doesn't need to be. That's not a strategy, it's a message. His voice was quiet. Absolute. Jiyeon needs to understand what happens when he makes this personal. Tonight I'm going to make sure he understands. Sang-min looked at his boss for a long moment. Then he nodded the nod of a man who had stopped trying to talk sense into a force of nature, and turned toward the stairs. He was on the 3rd step when they heard it, a small sound. Above them. The particular soft-footed sound of a child who had woken up in a strange place and gone looking for a familiar one. Both men looked up. Mira was at the top of the stairs. She was in her socks and the oversized sleep shirt the housekeeper had found for her, hair slightly flattened on one side from the pillow, the crayon drawing held against her chest. She had the look of someone who had woken from a dream and needed to confirm that the person she was looking for was still real. She found Ji-hoon's face in the room below, and her shoulders dropped with relief. I woke up, she said simply, as if this explained everything. I see that. Ji-hoon's voice did the thing it only did for her, lost its operational edge, became something entirely different. Go back to the room, Mira. Sang-min is going to take you somewhere. She looked at Sang-min, then back at Ji-hoon. Where are you going? I have something to do here. Her eyes moved across the room, across the monitors, across the faces of the men stationed at the doors who were trying to look like nothing was happening, and failing completely. Mira was 6 years old, and she had spent enough time in enough wrong places to know what a room full of people preparing for something looked like. Are the bad men coming? She asked. Ji-hoon came to the foot of the stairs. He looked up at her. Yes, he said, because he did not lie to her. He had decided that on the first night, without even articulating it, this child had been lied to by the world enough times. He would not be one more person who told her everything was fine when it wasn't. Mira absorbed this. Her fingers tightened on the drawing. Then I'm staying with you, she said. You promised. Her voice was very small and very firm. You said together, in the penthouse. You said together. The room was quiet. Ji-hoon held her gaze. This child, this impossible, stubborn, brave, infuriating child, who quoted his own words back to him with the precision of a lawyer, and the eyes of someone who understood, on a level that went below language, what it meant to watch someone you loved walk toward danger and be told to go the other way. Turned around. He understood, looking at her now, that she would not do it again. Not for anything. He climbed 3 steps, sat down on the stairs so they were level, looked at her directly. I need you to go with Sang-min, he said. Not because I'm leaving you, because I need to know you're safe so I can do what I need to do. Do you understand the difference? Her bottom lip pressed tight. If I know you're safe, he continued, I can fight. If I don't know if I'm worried about you, then I can't. And these men coming here tonight, Mira, they are coming because of what you heard. Which means you are the most important person in this building and I need you protected. She looked at him for a long, searching moment. You'll come after? She asked. I will come after, he responded. You promise? Like a real promise, not a maybe promise. Like a real promise, she studied his face. Every line of it, the way she had studied it the first night in the warehouse, when she had decided, with 6-year-old certainty, that this terrifying blood-spattered man had kind eyes. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture so instinctive, so purely a child reaching for the person who had become her safe place, that the youngest of Ji-hoon's men at the door had to look at the ceiling. Okay, she whispered. But come back or I'll be very angry. He almost smiled. I know. She pulled back, looked at him one more second. Then she turned to Sang-min with total composure, drawing tucked against her chest, and said, I need my shoes. They're by the back door. Sang-min exhaled. I'll get them. They were gone in 4 minutes. Ji-hoon watched the car pull away on the monitor and then turned to face the room, his men, his building, the 6 vehicles on the outer camera feeds that had just turned into the far end of the lane. He rolled up his sleeves. Positions, he said. What happened in the next 22 minutes was not something that would appear in any police report. The CCTV on the lane had already been looped by one of Ji-hoon's tech people. The building's soundproofing was significant. The neighbors on this particular street had long ago learned that certain buildings on certain nights were best ignored. Ji-hoon moved through that building the way a storm moves, not randomly, not recklessly, but with the absolute focused inevitability of something that has been building pressure for weeks and has finally found its direction. 6 men came in. None of them walked back out. At the end of it, Ji-hoon was standing in the ground floor corridor with a cut above his left eye and his knuckles split and the particular stillness of a man who had just converted grief into something that would carry him forward. He took out his phone, called Sang-min. It's done. How is she? There was a pause. The sound of movement, a door, and then Sang-min's voice quieter. She refused to sleep until I called you. She's been sitting in the middle of Aisha's living room for 40 minutes with her arms folded, absolutely not sleeping. Ji-hoon leaned against the wall. Put her on. A shuffling sound, then a small voice trying very hard to be casual, betrayed entirely by the relief flooding through every syllable. Dada, I'm here. A long breath on the other end of the line. The sound of a 6-year-old girl, who had been holding herself together by sheer force of will, finally, privately, letting the tension go. I wasn't scared, she said. I know, he replied. I was only a little scared, she said. That's allowed. Another pause. Then, with the absolute certainty of someone stating a fact that was not up for discussion, I'm not moving again until you get here. I'll be there in 30 minutes. 20, she countered. 30, Mira, 25. He looked at the ceiling, at the building around him, at everything Jean Byung-soo had sent tonight to erase a 6-year-old girl who had witnessed something she shouldn't have. And what was left of it now? 25, he said. Go to sleep. I'll sleep when you get. Mira. But she had gone back to Sang-min because she had gotten what she needed and she was 6 years old and negotiation was a tool you used and then put down. Sang-min came back on the line. He sounded like a man trying not to laugh in a situation that did not technically merit laughing. 25 minutes, boss, he said. She's holding you to it. Ji-hoon pushed off the wall, looked at his watch. Tell her 20, he said, and walked out into the Seoul night. 3 weeks later, Seoul was holding its breath, not in a way that was obvious. Nothing that made the news, altered traffic, or disrupted the usual vibrant hum of the city. The street vendors still set up at dawn. The subway continued running every 4 minutes. The Han River flowed beneath its bridges, unchanged and unaffected by human affairs. But in certain rooms, in certain circles, in the underground architecture of a city that had always had two faces, something was shifting. Something large and load-bearing was coming loose, and the people who paid attention to such things could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not the storm itself. Just the knowledge that it was coming, and that when it arrived, nothing would look quite the same after. Kwon Ji-hoon was the storm. He had spent 3 weeks doing what he did better than anyone alive, not fighting loudly, not moving recklessly, but working with the patient, devastating precision of a man who had spent 15 years building a network specifically, so that when the moment came to pull it apart thread by thread, he would know exactly which thread to pull first. John Byung-soo's organization had 6 revenue streams. Ji-hoon cut 4 of them in the first week quietly, through third parties in ways that looked like bad luck or market forces, or the kind of ordinary entropy that afflicts businesses that operate outside the law. No bodies, no evidence, just 4 streams of money that stopped flowing and did not start again. The 5th stream he let run, so Jian would feel it happening and not know where it was coming from, so the paranoia would set in, so the man would start looking sideways at his own people, the way Ji-hoon had looked sideways at his own for 8 months, without knowing where to look. Let him feel that. The 6th stream Ji-hoon saved for last, because the 6th stream was the one that connected back to the shipping company in Mapogu, the one Tades Bekele had been working for, when he found the wrong manifest, and asked the wrong question, and died alone on a street in a city that hadn't known his name. That one Ji-hoon was going to shut down in person. Mira had not been told the details. She was 6, almost 7 now, a fact she mentioned with increasing frequency and pointed significance, and she did not need the details. What she knew was that Ji-hoon came home every night, that he was doing something important, that the world outside was complicated and the world inside their current safe house, a proper apartment in Yongsan that Sang-min had sourced inside 48 hours, and that Mira had immediately begun improving with drawings, was safe. She had settled into the new space with the same practical acceptance she brought to everything, assessed it, rearranged the things she could reach, decided the kitchen window had the best light, and installed herself there every morning with her drawing pad and a bowl of whatever she had convinced Ji-hoon to make for breakfast. She was teaching him Amharic. It had started accidentally. She had said something to herself in the kitchen, low and private, and he had asked what it meant, and she had looked at him with the expression of someone discovering an unexpected opportunity. Now every morning there was a word, just one. She was a thorough teacher and believed in consolidation before expansion. He had learned Amisaginelehu thank you on day 1, pronounced it badly, was corrected without mercy, and practiced it until she nodded. Betum Kanjo, very beautiful, which she used exclusively to describe her own drawings. Liege child. Ababa father, on the morning he learned Ababa. She had watched him repeat it and then gone very quiet in that particular way of hers, not sad, not withdrawn, just present with something, sitting with it, giving it the space it needed. That's what I called my abeoji, she said. Ababa. I know, he said. She looked up. Sang-min told me about him, Ji-hoon said carefully. Your father, Tades. He had rehearsed how much to say, how to give a 6-year-old the truth in the right-sized pieces. He was a good man, he was brave. What happened to him was wrong, and the people responsible for it are going to answer for it. Mira was very still. You knew him? She asked. No, but I know what he did, and I know why. She looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she said quietly, he always said do the right thing even when it costs you. He said that was the whole job. A pause. I didn't understand what he meant. I think I do now. Ji-hoon looked at this child 7 years old in 2 weeks, wise in ways that no 7-year-old should have to be, carrying a grief that was too large for her frame, and bearing it anyway with the specific dignity of someone who had decided that the people they had lost deserved to be honored by how you lived after them. He would be proud of you, Ji-hoon said. Mira looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to her drawing, which was her way of accepting something too large to respond to directly. After a moment, she said without looking up, "You can keep learning Amharic. You're not very good yet, but you're trying hard and that counts." Ji-hoon looked at the ceiling. "Thank you," he said. "Amasegyinalehu," she corrected. The end came on a Thursday, in the middle of an ordinary week, when all the patient invisible work finally accumulated into a single point of collapse. Jung Byung-soo made a mistake. Cornered men always did. With 4 revenue streams gone, and his organization hemorrhaging trust from the inside, Ji-hoon had spent the 3rd week ensuring that the right rumors reached the right ears. That Jeon's own lieutenants started questioning whether the boss who had ordered a hit on a 7-year-old girl and then sent men after a 6-year-old orphan was someone worth dying for. Jeon did what frightened powerful men always did. He moved and pulled his remaining operation to a single location. He was brave. What happened to him was wrong, and the people responsible for it are going to answer for it. Mira was very still. "You knew him?" she asked. "No, but I know what he did, and I know why." She looked at her hands for a long moment, then she said quietly, "He always said do the right thing even when it costs you. He said that was the whole job." A pause. I didn't understand what he meant. I think I do now. Ji-hoon looked at this child 7 years old in 2 weeks, wise in ways that no 7-year-old should have to be, carrying a grief that was too large for her frame, and bearing it anyway, with the specific dignity of someone who had decided that the people they had lost deserved to be honored by how you lived after them. "He would be proud of you," Ji-hoon said. Mira looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to her drawing, which was her way of accepting something too large to respond to directly. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "You can keep learning Amharic. You're not very good yet, but you're trying hard and that counts." Ji-hoon looked at the ceiling. "Thank you," he said. "Amasegyinalehu," she corrected. The end came on a Thursday, in the middle of an ordinary week, when all the patient invisible work finally accumulated into a single point of collapse. Jung Byung-soo made a mistake. Cornered men always did. With 4 revenue streams gone, and his organization hemorrhaging trust from the inside, Ji-hoon had spent the 3rd week ensuring that the right rumors reached the right ears. That Jeon's own lieutenants started questioning whether the boss who had ordered a hit on a 7-year-old girl and then sent men after a 6-year-old orphan was someone worth dying for. Jeon did what frightened powerful men always did. He moved and pulled his remaining operation to a single location, the top floor of a privately owned building near Namsan Tower. Chosen because it had one entrance and visibility in all directions, and because cornered men always believed that height was the same as safety. Ji-hoon let him get comfortable there for exactly 48 hours. Then he went. The building near Namsan at 11 p.m. was all shadow and altitude soul spread in every direction below. The tower itself lit against the dark sky like something that had decided to stay standing out of pure stubbornness. Ji-hoon took the stairs, not because the elevator wasn't working, because he had 16 floors to think, and he wanted to arrive at the top having made every decision already, leaving nothing to the heat of the moment. He had spent 20 years learning that heat was the enemy of outcome, that rage felt like power but acted like sabotage, and that the coldest version of himself had always been the most effective. Tonight he needed to be colder than he had ever been. Because tonight he was doing this for Onji, for Tadessa Bekele, for a 6-year-old girl who had spent 3 days alone in a warehouse and still found it in herself to reach for someone. And those reasons deserved precision. They deserved intention. They deserved something that would last. He came through the stairwell door on the 16th floor and moved through what remained of Jung Byung-soo's inner circle with the systematic efficiency of a man solving a problem he had already solved in his head 12 times. His men came up from below. Sang-min's team locked the exits. The whole operation took 9 minutes. At the end of 9 minutes, Jung Byung-soo was on the rooftop, and so was Ji-hoon. The rooftop had no railing on the north side, a renovation that had been abandoned midway and never resumed. The wind up here was constant and cold, pulling at jackets, carrying the distant sound of the city below. Jeon was a broad man, thick through the chest, the kind of physical presence that had always communicated power in the rooms he walked into. He was 61 years old, and he had built his organization over 30 years of specific ruthlessness, and he had never once, in 30 years, found himself in a position he could not negotiate his way out of. He understood, standing on this rooftop, that the position he was in now was different. Ji-hoon walked toward him without hurrying. Jian raised his chin. You're going to throw everything away over a child that isn't even yours. Yes, Ji-hoon said simply. Something flickered in Jian's face, the micro-expression of a man whose script has just been rendered useless. He had prepared for denial, for rage, for the negotiating language of two men who understood each other's world. He had not prepared for simple acknowledgement. She's no one, Jian said. An Ethiopian orphan who was in the wrong place. She was in the wrong place because your men killed her father. Ji-hoon stopped 10 feet away. She was alone in a warehouse for 3 days because your men took the only person she had. She almost died because you decided a 6-year-old child was a loose end. He tilted his head slightly. Tell me more about who she is. Jian's jaw tightened. I did what I had to. You ordered a drive-by that killed my daughter, Ji-hoon said, still flat, still even, still holding everything he was inside the absolute stillness of a man who had decided what this night would cost, and paid it in advance. You killed a man who did nothing except try to do the right thing. You sent men to a building where a 6-year-old girl was sleeping. A pause. You ran out of hattos a long time ago. He raised his gun. Jian glanced at it, then at Ji-hoon's face. His eyes shifted to the northern edge of the rooftop, where the railing had been torn away, revealing a steep, 16-story drop beyond. He had one card left. He played it. Kill me and Shadow Lotus burns with me, he said. I have documentation. Everything your operations, your accounts, your people. Stored off-site, timed release, goes to the authorities the moment I don't check in. He let this land. Watched Ji-hoon's face for the reaction. You pull that trigger and you spend the rest of your life in a cell. The girl grows up without you. Is that what your daughter would have wanted? The rooftop was silent except for the wind. Ji-hoon held the gun level. He thought about NG, about the teddy bear and the white silk and the Sunday mornings with the cold feet against his legs, about a 7-year-old girl standing in front of a smaller girl and shouting run, and meaning it with everything she had. He thought about what she had sent back through Mira. Tell him he has kind eyes. His finger tightened on the trigger, and then his phone rang. A video call, and the name on the screen was Sang-min, which meant Sang-min had overridden every protocol and every instruction about communication silence during an operation, which meant something had happened that Sang-min had decided outweighed all of that. Ji-hoon looked at the screen. Sang-min's face appeared for half a second, and then the camera tilted and there was Mira, in Aisha's living room, sitting cross-legged on the sofa in her sleep shirt, both hands wrapped around the phone, looking directly into the camera with an expression that meant she had been awake this entire time and had decided she was done waiting. She looked at him, at whatever she could read in the pixels of his face, in the wind behind him, in the quality of the silence, and she understood immediately, with the terrifying perceptiveness of a child who had spent her whole life learning to read rooms, exactly where he was and what he was about to do. Her face did something, and then she said 7 words. In the small, direct voice of a 6-year-old girl, who had decided that the situation called for the most important thing she knew how to say. Dada, she said you have kind eyes. The rooftop stopped. Ji-hoon stood completely still. Eunji's words echoed in Mira's voice, cutting through the stillness of the Seoul rooftop at 11 p.m. The man stood at the precise edge of who he had been for 20 years and who he had become in the past 4 weeks. A gun rested in his hand. A choice stretched before him, and on the phone screen in front of him, a little girl watched, her gaze fixed on his face as if the entire world depended on what she saw there. She said you have kind eyes. Jian said something. Ji-hoon did not hear it. He heard NG in the back of a car counting red ones. He heard her cold feet against his legs at 5 a.m. He heard Dada in the way that meant, I really need you. He heard a 7-year-old girl push someone smaller behind a car and shout run and mean it with everything. He heard Mira saying a baba over a breakfast bowl and going quiet. He heard himself saying, I promise on a staircase in Mapo. He lowered the gun, not slowly, not dramatically. He simply lowered it, the way you put down something you have been carrying too long, not because you have been defeated, but because you have finally understood what it weighs. Jian blinked. You're letting me go, he said. Less a question than an attempt to believe it. No, Ji-hoon said, his voice steady. I'm choosing how this ends. He met Jian's gaze, his expression devoid of hatred, mercy, or anything that could be mistaken for either just the absolute clear-eyed assessment of a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at a different answer than the one he had come up here with. Your documentation goes nowhere, because by morning there will be nothing left for it to document. Shadow Lotus is done. I'm done. A pause. But you will stand before every person whose life you've destroyed, and you will answer for it. Not with a bullet, not on a rooftop, but in a room, with lawyers, a record, and your name attached to everything you've done, exposed in the light where it can't be hidden. Jian stared at him. You'd rather I go to prison than die, he said slowly, like he was translating something from a language he didn't speak. I'd rather Mira grows up knowing that the man responsible for her father's death answered for it, Ji-hoon said. That it's on record. That it exists. That it can't be erased or rewritten or forgotten because someone decided a bullet was tidier. He held Jian's gaze. She deserves that. Her father deserved that. He stepped back. Prosecutor on standby for a week. I was hoping we'd get here. You knew? I know you. A pause. She's looking at you, by the way. She hasn't blinked. Ji-hoon looked at the phone screen. At Mira, still cross-legged, still holding the phone with both hands, still watching his face with those enormous, careful eyes. Go to sleep, he said. Is it over? She asked. He gazed at the Seoul skyline, neon lights reflecting in the rain, the tower shining against the dark, and the Han River flowing quietly below, moving as it always had, steady, constant, and unbothered. It's over, he said. Mira looked at him for one more long moment, checking, confirming, running whatever internal verification process a 6-year-old runs when they need to know that the answer they are receiving is the real one. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. Amiseginallahu Dada, thank you. Ji-hoon looked at the phone screen. Betam Konjo, he said. Very beautiful. She had used it on her drawings. He was using it on her. She understood immediately. He could see it in her face, the way it shifted, the way she pressed her lips together to contain something, and then she lowered the phone, and the screen went dark. Ji-hoon stood on the rooftop for one more moment. Then he buttoned his jacket, put his phone in his pocket, and walked to the stairwell door. Behind him, his men moved toward Jean Bang-soo, with zip ties and a prosecutor's contact number, and the end of 30 years. 1 year later. It was a Sunday. The cemetery outside Seoul was quiet, the kind of stillness that only autumn brings. Neither empty nor sorrowful, just peaceful. The trees were beginning to change color at the edges, and the air held the crisp chill of a season on the verge of shifting. Ji-hoon and Mira walked the path to Yoonji's grave together. Mira was 7 now. She had celebrated with a party that Aisha had organized, and Ji-hoon had stood in the middle of it, surrounded by 7-year-olds, streamers, and a cake shaped like a lion. Mira had chosen the lion cake herself, and no one in Ji-hoon's circle had dared to argue. She wore a yellow dress, the same shade as the one in the crayon drawing. She was carrying flowers, yellow ones, which she had selected herself at the market that morning with the focus of someone making an important decision. Ji-hoon walked beside her. He was not the same man who had stood at this grave a year ago with a flat face and cold hands and a war to build. He was not identical to the man who had walked into Aisha's living room at 1:15 a.m. to find a 6-year-old sitting cross-legged on a sofa, with her arms folded, refusing to sleep. He was still recognizably himself, still the silences, still the economy of expression, still the particular quality of stillness that had made men afraid of him for 2 decades. But there was something else in him now, something that had grown in the space Mira had moved into without asking permission, the way plants grow in cracks, not despite the difficulty of the surface, but because of the light that found its way through. Shadow Lotus was gone, dismantled piece by piece over 3 months, not blown apart, but taken down the way you take down a building in the middle of a city, carefully, methodically, so the things around it stayed standing. The legitimate businesses remained. The people who had worked for him and wanted a different future had been helped toward one. The ones who hadn't, that was between them and whatever came next. Jean Byung-soo was in a courtroom. He had been for 6 months. The documentation he had threatened Ji-hoon with on the rooftop had become, with significant legal maneuvering and Sang-min's considerable organizational talent, the documentation that was dismantling him. Tades Bakela's name was on the record, his death was on the record, his daughter would know that it was on the record. Mira crouched at the grave and placed the yellow flowers carefully, not quickly, not perfunctorily, but with the same focused deliberateness she brought to everything that mattered. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the stone. Big sister, she said. I came back. I said I would. The trees moved. The air was very still. Dada is different now, she continued, conversationally, the way she always spoke to Eunji, not like she was performing grief, but like she was genuinely catching up a friend on recent events. He learned some Amharic. He's not very good, but he tries hard. I told him that counts. There was a pause. He makes eggs now, properly, I taught him. She tilted her head. He still watches too many security feeds, but Sang Min says that's permanent, so I'm leaving it. Ji-hoon, standing behind her, looked at the grave. He did not speak yet. He let her have her time. I think about you every day, Mira said, quieter now. I think about the fish braid, the red cars and the yellow door place. I think about you pushing me. Her voice thinned at the edges. I used to feel bad about that. That you were in front and I was behind. Sang-min said you saved me. Dada said you made a choice. She looked at the stone. I think you were just being you. You just decided things. A leaf came down from the nearest tree, landed at the base of the headstone. I'm going to be okay, Mira said. Matter-of-factly, definitively. In the way she said things that she had decided were true, and were therefore going to be true through the sheer force of her insisting on them. I wanted you to know that, because I think you might have wondered. She placed one hand flat on the stone for a moment, just a moment. I'm going to be really, really okay. She stood up, brushed the grass from her knees. Then she turned and looked up at Ji-hoon. He looked down at her. Something passed between them, not words, not performance, just the specific silent understanding of two people who had found each other in the wreckage of the same night and had decided, separately and together, to build something from it. Mira reached up. He took her hand. They stood at the grave for a while, the tall man with kind eyes and the young girl in the yellow. Ress, with her lion-shaped birthday cake and her lively bilingual commentary on everything. And beyond the trees, the city continued, loud and indifferent, as cities do. Then Mira said, "Can we get ramyeon on the way home?" Ji-hoon looked at her. "We have food at home. I want ramyeon from the place with the red door, the one where the harmony puts extra egg. You have a preference for which specific restaurant's egg. It's a better egg. It's the same egg." Dada. She looked up at him with an expression of profound patience. It is not the same egg. He looked at the sky, at the trees, at the grave, at the yellow flowers she had placed, at the name carved in stone, at the small leaf that had landed like something deliberate. He looked at Mira, at the girl who had been left alone in the dark and had survived it, who had carried a dead girl's last words across a warehouse and delivered them to the person who needed them most, who had called a stranger Dada before she knew his name and had been right about his eyes when everyone else was too afraid to look. "Fine," he said. "The red door place." Mira smiled. It was Onji's smile. He had thought so from the first night. He had not said it. He had carried it privately in the way he carried most things, wide, certain, and completely sure of itself. The smile of someone who had decided joy was available and was going to take it with both hands. He held her hand a little tighter. She swung their joined hands once the way children do, when they are happy and do not need to explain it, and they walked together down the path toward the gate. Behind them, on the headstone, a second leaf came down and settled beside the flowers. Yellow, like the color of a crayon drawing that had survived a warehouse, a war, and a year of everything, still hanging on the wall above, a 7-year-old's bed in a Yongsan apartment. Me and my new little sister.